Hello and welcome back to In Progress. My name is Raymond Perez. So I have not posted in 6 months. That is the elephant in the room. I guess not really. I'm not certain that you really care about that. But the truth is I have not posted in the past 6 months. And there is a reason for that, which is that I've had other things to do. Now, recently I've been abroad. I've been traveling the world through my studies, and I met the Prime Minister of St. Lucia, whose name is Philip Pierre, and that actually got me thinking about the world and Latin America more broadly, even though I know St. Lucia isn't a part of Latin America, technically. But there has been a growing movement in Latin America called the Pink Tide. Now, you may be wondering, is this deja vu? I've heard of the pink tide before, but that pink tide ended in around the 2010s and was replaced by the blue wave. Not the blue wave we're going to see in November, but the blue wave in Latin America. Now, the answer is yes, you are actually seeing a form of deja vu, and we're going to talk about the parallels between that pink tide and this pink tide. But at its very basics, what I want to talk about today is this new pink tide, right? This new left that we're seeing in Latin America. And I'm going to try to answer, is this a promise? Is this an illusion? And let's take a look first at the first slide, which I don't remember what it is. Okay, there we go. So this first slide displays what we're talking about, right? It displays the pink tide. So here we have 3 maps. Where the red is a left-wing party and the blue is a right-wing party. And the map basically shows, which party rules which country. So you can see in 2011, this is at the end of the first pink tide, right? Most of these countries are ruled by socialist or left-leaning parties. So we have of course you have your Cuba, Venezuela, Nicaragua, but you also have your Brazil, Peru, Argentina. These major democracies are now being ruled by a left-wing party. So in Brazil, I think this is Rousseff at the time. You may remember Dilma Rousseff from the Rio Olympics and the fallout from that. You have Cristina Fernandez de Kirchner, who ruled Argentina at the time, and her ideology is still dominant within the center-left in Argentina. But yeah, and Evo Morales, of course, in Bolivia. But at some point, partly due to a lot of the corruption in these left-wing governments, partly due to lagging economic indicators throughout these left-wing governments, you see a major switch to the right. And that switch to the right is sometimes called the blue wave, right? I don't know if I made this joke already. Okay, well, not the blue wave. I'll cut it out if I didn't. Not the blue wave that we're going to see in November, but a blue wave nonetheless. And also, we have the Bolsonaro election in Brazil. We have the Macri election in Argentina, and we basically have most of these countries moving towards the right. Now, let's be very clear about what this right is. This right is generally, let's put aside Bolsonaro, generally a center-right. Something similar to the old neocons in the Republican Party. It's not this far-right neo-nationalism that you begin to see post-2016 in the United States and around Western Europe. These tend to be, your principled statesmen. But the principled statesmen, of course, fail, right? And a lot of that failure is due to the same issues, right? High debt, high inflation, lagging indicators in terms of GDP, recessionary factors. I mean, a lot of these things lead to social inequality, and it leads to unrest, and it leads to a move back towards the left. And we're beginning to see that not just in Latin America, but perhaps around the world. But it is most clear in Latin America, right? You have Mexico in 2018. In 2019, you see which one? Argentina, with the election of Alberto Fernandez. You see this year, right, major elections in terms of, well, actually last year was Castillo in Peru. Chile with Boric, and Colombia this year with Gustavo Petro, and also Honduras with, I believe, Zelaya. But anyway, all these countries are moving towards the left, and that's a huge thing because, generally, when the left is in power in Latin America, right, that means that the U.S. is seeing a recession in its power in Latin America. The question of whether that's ideological is something we'll get into later, but the truth is that the left in Latin America has tended to be opposed to the United States, but I don't really see that to be the case right now. But anyway, that's a lot of words to say that Latin America is moving back towards the left, and many people on the left are happy about it. So let's take a look at what we want to talk about. So we want to talk about here the ideological evolution of the Latin American left. That's number one. Number two, has the pink tide been successful? And number three, what does this mean for U.S.-Latin America relations? And let's first talk about how it started, right? So depending on your positions on Hugo Chavez, you may or may not be upset with what I'm going to say. Okay, so let's take a few steps back and let's talk about the 1990s. So first, basically, the Soviet Union was a major player in Latin America. And a lot of the issues in Latin America arose because of the Cold War, right? In Africa, you talk about the Cold War, you have questions about to what extent socialism was really important in, the Biafra War, right? But here, it is much more clear about the dispute between left and right being actually violent, right? And we can even talk about that happening before the Cold War, right? Like in Colombia, the civil wars were tended to be between liberals and conservatives, right? So this is not a specifically Cold War issue, but it just tends to be baked into Latin American political culture, right? So at its very basics, the Cold War was between capitalism and communism, and that played out in Latin America, right? The United States supported the capitalist countries generally, and the Soviet Union supported the socialist countries generally, right? So the 1990s sees the Soviet Union collapse. And by the way, the Soviet Union under Gorbachev was kind of pulling out of these regions even before the 1990s, even throughout the 1980s, because the Soviet Union did not have the power projection to continue to prop up these regimes in Latin America, right? But anyway, putting all that aside, the truth is that even by that time, socialism in Latin America was in a recession, right? And the primary reason was because it had been thoroughly discredited by the end of the Cold War. I mean, socialism throughout the world actually had been thoroughly discredited because Soviet-style socialism, failed. It failed pretty remarkably. And there were a lot of questions as to what that meant for socialism. And one of the answers was put forth by Heinz Dieterich, who was a German political philosopher who I believe lives in Mexico, or lived, I don't know if he's alive. Anyway, in 1996, he pushes forth this idea of the socialism of the 21st century, that 20th century socialism had failed, and it very clearly had, right? And that there needs to be a new revisionist Marxism, right? So you have this beginning of this new socialism. And the three main components were democratic ownership of the means of production, which for any Marxist, it's pretty clear what that means. That is, at its very basics, Marxist. No other word for that. And you have this opinion of majoritarianism, right? Majoritarianism being this idea that the majority should determine what happens. And you may say that that's what democracy is, but democracy, at least as it exists in most countries, is not explicitly majoritarian. In fact, there is a question about majoritarianism as a political belief, because it can lead to authoritarianism. If the majority wants something, they can push for it, and that might be authoritarian. And in most political democracies, there is some way to stop that. For instance, most democracies have an upper house, like the Senate, or a Supreme Court, like the United States does, or something like the Electoral College, which let's put that aside as its own problem. But the socialism of the 21st century pushes forth majoritarianism, which, by the way, tends to be something that socialists support. But then not only that, you have social justice, which includes protection of minority rights, so that majoritarian instinct is sort of tempered by social justice. Anyway, those are your three tenets of 21st century socialism. Now, the truth is that this new socialism was itself discredited in Venezuela, because the Venezuelan economy, although it was pretty strong before the accession of Hugo Chavez, it basically went to crap after Chavez came to power, and after a lot of the issues regarding debt, regarding the oil companies, much of that made Venezuela less stable. Of course, inflation really begins to take a major hold in Venezuela, although that primarily is after the death of Chavez in, I believe, 2011. Now, also, you have the 2007 referendum, which tried to create this majoritarian constitution, and also tried to give Chavez basically unlimited power. It did actually fail, but the point is that this is actually where Diederik breaks with Chavez and begins to criticize Chavez. Now, this type of socialism is perhaps something that is admirable in a sense, right? I'm no socialist, but perhaps socialists. I know socialists who believe that this is a good way to shape socialism for the future, right? Because command economies seem to be discredited after the Soviet Union's collapse. But this socialism eventually gives way because of the Venezuela crisis. So this is how I view the pink tide today, right? And this is not necessarily something that is true, but some people agree with this. I'm sure that some people disagree. So first, you have this first wave, as I've been talking about, which is revisionist Marxism, right? Generally anti-Americanism. And I say generally, but I should actually say it's probably ubiquitous among these pink tide movements, at least at the beginning, right? So Venezuela, of course, was famously anti-US for ideological reasons, perhaps, but generally anti-US. Anti-democratic often, as I mentioned with the 2007 Venezuela referendum. You do see attacks on democracy and democratic institutions. It is often militant, right? But this militant Marxism is not necessarily to the extent of, the Shining Path in Peru, or, other anti-capitalist militias that had existed. Like, it's no Sandinista, to be very clear, but it is militant in rhetoric, which is less important than being militant in practice, but it was militant in rhetoric. And it was centered mostly on economic justice, right? I do mention that 21st century socialism is supposed to center social justice as well, but of course, being a Marxist movement, it does center economic justice, which is for better or for worse, right? Depending on the type of socialist you are. Now, the second wave, which is the modern pink tide, I see as not necessarily Marxist in nature, right? Marxists, communists, do support those regimes, right? They do support these pink tide movements, right? But they aren't necessarily Marxist themselves, right? So, for instance, Boric was elected with the help of the Communist Party, but Boric himself is not a communist. The same thing can be said for Castillo, who, although he was elected by the Marxists in the Free Peru Party, was not necessarily a Marxist himself, and you can kind of see this based on his actions. But there are some real Marxists, like Gustavo Petro, who have been elected, right? But most of them are not actually Marxists. They're just socialists. And even for some of them, you can consider it not socialism, but left populism, whatever that means. You may know from my previous videos that I don't like using the term populism, but people do, so I will. Are they ambivalent on the US? Yes. By and large, some are not just ambivalent, but friendly towards the US. AMLO, for instance, the only 2 international trips he's ever taken are to the United States, I think. That may have changed recently, but that's just a fun fact to know. Castillo went to the U.S. as well. The U.S. has not been the boogeyman that it has been for the first wave of this left movement. Now, pro-democracy, generally, they're pro-democracy. What I mean by that is that they were democratically elected, and they don't seem to be anti-democracy. Now, we can talk about AMLO's moves, we can talk about a lot of it, but this is generalization, pro-democracy, right? Peaceful, same thing, generalization. And then also economic justice as well as social justice, and I don't really know what else to say on that other than social justice is a major part of this second wave, right? There's indigenous movements like the Mapuche in Chile, like Evo Morales and the indigenous movement in Bolivia, and the indigenous movement in Peru, right? Those are, some social justice things that have been occurring. Abortion has been a major issue in terms of Mexico, although that was the Supreme Court, not really AMLO, and in I believe Argentina legalized abortion as well. So yes, social justice, economic justice, two major important things. Okay, so now let's discuss I did three. No, I did four. Four countries. Mexico, Argentina, Peru, and Chile, which all are part of this second pink tide. I'm going to discuss them as what they did, and then I'm going to evaluate them. So first we have, of course, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, who is generally referred to in the West as AMLO. Okay, so basically, he got elected in 2018 in a landslide victory. I mean, I think he only lost Mexico City. Mexico City voted for PAN, I think, at the time. I don't really remember, but I think that was the case. So, Enrique Peña Nieto, who was part of the PRI, which was a centrist party, which is a centrist party, that used to basically govern Mexico in a quasi-dictatorship. But by this time, they'd already been removed from that type of power. In 2000, I think they lost their first election to PAN. And that may have been Vicente Fox, but I don't remember. Anyway, Nieto is part of PRI, and he loses to, he doesn't run again, but the PRI loses to AMLO. And AMLO is part of Morena, which is I believe at the time it was a new party, but the left had always existed in Mexico, but that specifically was a new party. And he basically won in a landslide, as I mentioned. He called it the fourth transformation because there were three other transformations in Mexico: the Mexican Revolution, the other Mexican Revolution, and what was the second one? The first one, the third one. I don't remember the second one. It could be the 1860s issues with Maximilian, but I don't remember. Anyway, putting that aside. So he calls his new election, basically a transformation in the sense of like a revolution, right? So it sounds like this revolutionary politics that is very powerful in leftist circles. But to be clear, AMLO is not a leftist. He is a center-left person. And he begins his administration courting the global left, but not really, right? He provides Evo Morales, the president of Bolivia, asylum after he was removed from power. I will not call it a coup d'etat, but he was removed from power. Now, there was a war on institutions that he began. He moved against the courts, although that more happened in 2020. He moved against the bureaucracy in order to establish control over all of those things, right? And he also has the support of the military, right? He does court the support of the military in this weird, corruption issue that was occurring. He backed this general, but it's not really worth getting into. The point is that he is trying to establish his control over the institutions of Mexico. So in 2020, even worse things begin to happen, right? So COVID-19 skepticism increases, and AMLO sort of rides that wave of COVID-19 skepticism. He basically, doesn't really change his schedule. He continues to do these massive meetings, and COVID-19 explodes in Mexico. And in fact, this is why some people have begun to call him Mexico's Trump, although Trump represents a completely different thing than AMLO, so I think it's kind of a silly comparison. But put that aside. The truth is that AMLO, regardless of whether he is Mexico's Trump, is an anti-institutionalist, which is a major issue, especially in Latin America, which does not have a great track record with anti-institutionalists. So now you have in Mexico a terrible recession, the worst except for Argentina, which we'll discuss later, and an increased reliance on fossil fuels, especially with Pemex, the state petroleum company. And Pemex is heavily indebted, very heavily indebted, in a way that's... I actually studied Pemex, I think a year ago now, and it is so sad how indebted they are. But anyway, that and his court legalized abortion, although, to be fair, I wouldn't really put that on AMLO. Anyway, in 2021, I believe July 2021, or it could be July 2020, the USMCA takes effect, which is the new NAFTA. And you're beginning to see a few issues for AMLO. He's kind of been, he actually, I think, is the most popular G20 leader, or second most popular G20 leader. He has massive support in Mexico, but he loses his supermajority in the congressional midterms. And he, begins to see even worse returns for inflation and in terms of debt, which is just an issue with Latin America and is not really unique to Mexico. Anyway, he begins to, after this loss in the midterms, he begins to try to change how elections are done, right? Because, that's just what these populists do. And then he nationalizes lithium, and we're still seeing what happens with that. So, he gets elected in 2018 as a change candidate, but he kind of governs as a center-left candidate. But now he's moving against the institutions, which is something that generally doesn't occur on the center. So what's happening with him, we have yet to see. Now let's talk about Argentina. Argentina has been in major recession since, I don't know at this point, since the 1990s. It's just been terrible to live in Argentina. I mean, massive inflation, massive debt crises. It just sucks, right? The Argentine economy is probably the saddest of the entire G20 in the sense that, it really shouldn't be as bad as it is, but it's just horrible. So let's begin with Alberto Fernandez defeating Mauricio Macri, who actually, Macri is generally seen as a good president outside of Argentina, which is funny. But Macri loses to Fernandez partly because of skyrocketing inflation, partly because of the fact that he can't really get the debt restructured, which, needs to happen in order to get more debt, which Argentina is trying to do. Now, basically, Fernandez is part of the Justicialist Party, easier to say in Spanish, which is Partido Justicialista. Okay, I guess it's not. Partido Justicialista. That party is a Peronist party. Now, what is Peronism? Peronism is sort of a center-left authoritarian ideology, which is based on the teachings and leadership of Juan Perón, who was a... Do we call him military? No, I don't. Because that's not really true. But Juan Perón was I don't even want to call him a dictator, because I want to be precise with my words. He was an authoritarian leader in Argentina, and he was a left-wing leader. He was not necessarily a socialist. I don't believe he would call himself a socialist, but Juan Perón and eventually Eva Perón, who is famous from the musical Evita, they are revered in segments of Argentina. Now, Peronism eventually gives way in the Justicialist Party to Kirchnerism. And that's because Cristina Fernandez de Kirchner, who I believe we mentioned earlier on in this video, right? We talk about how Kirchnerism begins to supplant Peronism, and the main thing that happens there is that Kirchnerism is very clearly against neoliberalism, right? It's very clearly against this Washington consensus and against American influence, but it is also socially liberal, right? So pro-abortion, pro-choice. Don't want to say pro-abortion. That's cancelable now. Pro-choice and very, very strong in terms of liberal issues, let's say. So, as I mentioned, inflation, debt, and it's very bad for Fernandez when he takes power. Now, his bid to restructure debt fails, and Argentina has its 9th sovereign default in May. And that's bad. Of course, debt defaults are always bad when you're a country, but especially if you're a major economy, it's bad. And especially when, you know, I did a project on Argentina's Great Depression like a year or two ago. And basically, this is the same reason that Argentina goes into Great Depression, right, in the 1990s, because of debt default. And then you have like the Corralito and the Corralón, and then various other things that make Argentina out to be much worse as an investment hub than most other countries. Okay, also the Argentine peso needs stabilization, and that doesn't happen, obviously, because you're seeing 50% inflation, right? And this is even before the supply chain crisis and COVID-19. So then you have the VIP vaccine scandal where I believe his health minister was like giving out vaccines to people, like they were skipping the lines. That happened in Argentina. It also happened in Peru. It's just like something that just constantly happened. But anyway, so people got vaccines when they weren't supposed to get them. And then you also have like the lockdown party scandal, which of course famously happened in Great Britain as well. And then you have basically Fernandez having gotten like completely battered by scandals. His vice president, who is Kirchner, remember the former president of Argentina, basically just like tells him to reshuffle the cabinet. And people are speculating that Kirchner has a lot more control than Fernandez does in this government. So there's a cabinet reshuffle with a lot of like Kirchnerist allies being put into the government. But you still see a massive defeat in the midterms for Fernandez. And to be clear, the cabinet reshuffle happens after the midterm defeat, and partly influenced by that midterm defeat. So this year has actually been quite eventful for Argentina. First, in the Winter Olympics, Fernandez like goes over to Xi, has like a little photo shoot, and then like begs for debt help, which China is always willing to help with your debt. But ironically, that same year, which is I guess this year, I think it was even 2 months ago, there's a debt deal that was reached with the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, and that allows Argentina to continue servicing its debt, which, you know, still an issue. You have an increased controls on wheat and beef, even despite the shortage, which pissed off a lot of Argentine farmers who wanted to sell their wheat at higher prices because wheat prices are rising. But the government is like, we need the wheat and the beef here, not out of the country, which, you know, tends to hurt actually those businesses, but also tends to hurt the economy. Still, it's just questionable all the way around. And then runaway inflation, as I mentioned, people are beginning to switch to black market dollars, which is like Venezuela level and not something to do. And then, of course, he goes with the normal left issue, which is nationalizing some natural resource, which here is lithium, which, of course, does not seem to help with attracting investment, although I don't think China really cares about that. So let's talk about a quick change that may or may not be occurring. These previous two candidates were actually part of the center left in Latin America, right? AMLO is part of Morena, which, although it includes some left parties, it is not the left party. The left party is a workers' party in Mexico, and they actually lost a lot of seats. I believe to Morena, but they lost a lot of seats in the previous midterm. So that is bad for them, but good for the center left. And then Alberto Fernandez, of course, being a Peronist, which in Argentina is center-left. And they were running against center-right candidates, right? These, like, as I mentioned before, these, like, statesmen, Enrique Peña Nieto and Mauricio Macri. Both of these leaders were center-right, and although Nieto wasn't particularly competent, Macri was, and they were all political insiders. AMLO, Fernandez, Nieto, Macri, all political insiders. Here, the next two, Peru and Chile, are political outsiders, right? And they're running against hard right candidates who are also political outsiders. By the way, I know Fujimori was technically not a political outsider, but she is a right populist, so I'm just going to call her that just because it's easier. So yes, the next two are hard left candidates running against hard right candidates. who are both political outsiders. Now, will this be the outlook for Latin America as a whole? Well, we have a very small sample size. I mean, Colombia was the same thing with Gustavo Petro and Rodolfo Hernandez, but who knows? Because this next election in Brazil is Lula da Silva, Luis Inácio Lula da Silva against Jair Bolsonaro, and they're both, if not political insiders, they have been in politics before, right? Lula used to be president, and Bolsonaro is the current president, right? Although both are generally far left, far right. And when I say far, I'm not talking about like fascist or communist, but both are like on the extremes of their political spectrums. A little questionable there. I don't believe it's necessarily the outlook for Latin America, but it could be. Now, continuing on with Peru. So, Pedro Castillo, who was a primary school teacher, defeats Keiko Fujimori, who was the daughter of the former dictator Alberto Fujimori, which actually I think is a big part of how democracies die, the Fujimori story. But anyway, Castillo defeats Fujimori in a very close election with massive claims of voter fraud from both sides, actually, under the banner of Peru Libre. So, or sometimes called Free Peru in the English press. Now, Castillo wins with the support of rural provinces, but he actually loses congressional elections. This is important because generally Lima determines who wins Peruvian elections, and the fact that Castillo won off of a rural coalition is interesting, although he still lost congressional elections, so maybe a little less so. The ministers were generally left-wing, far left, in some cases, and they were generally inexperienced, right? Castillo, I think, appoints 3 other primary school teachers that were his personal friends to the cabinet, which is not the best way to run a country. So he faces several removal attempts from opposition Congress, right? You see a lot of influence peddling and a lot of staff corruption, right? One of his cabinet members, forget his first name, Pacheco, I think was his last, was like found with like $20,000 just like hidden somewhere. So not great for Peru. So there's a threat of impeachment. I think there were like 3 impeachments on him in that year. I think only 1 succeeds in getting past the threshold needed to begin impeachment hearings. But yeah, he's just like is in a massive war with Congress right now. Although you do see massive GDP growth. So, you win some, you lose some. Although, to be fair, Peru had a really bad economy regardless, so GDP growth may not be a great estimate here. Anyway, war in Ukraine leads to major inflation, which leads to widespread protests and widespread strikes, which lead to, authoritarian, moves against those protests. Castillo actually, June 2022, leaves Free Peru to become an independent, but he's not, he's not avoiding the hatred from the right of the Peruvian Congress, and he's actually facing, I think, his 5th impeachment hearing this month. So, not great for Peru, but not necessarily horrible either. Now, Peru, by the way, had a lot of political unrest before this, so this is not new, right? Basically, every president in Peruvian history, recent Peruvian history, has gotten impeached. I think Vizcarra was, I can't remember if that was Peru or Chile, but Martin Vizcarra, I think, got some form of impeachment. It was like 3 times. I remember covering this when it happened, or not when it happened, but after it happened, in conjunction with the Peruvian case. I've actually been following Peru for a while on this channel, so you can view the old Peru videos. I actually was bearish on Castillo, but bullish on his relation with the U.S., which both might have been correct. So, you take the wins, let's say. But Peru is taking a very big loss right now. He is also a social conservative. I don't think he's pro-choice. He might be pro-life. He also might be anti-LGBT rights, but it is also Peru. So, okay, so Chile, don't have much to say because he won the election in December 2021 and took power in March. So he defeats Cast. Forget his name. I know his initials are JAK, but I forget his actual name. Cast was, a far-right populist in the same vein of Trump, let's say. and I hate to compare people to Trump, but it's the easiest thing to do here. He's pushing for a new constitution, which seems likely to fail because the new constitution gives, according to people, too many rights to indigenous communities, and also bans a lot of mining, which Chile is a mining country, and that's not really good for the Chilean economy. So still a bit questionable there. Anyway, the point is that he is a social progressive, and he is pushing constitutional change. So what does this mean for the future? Now, I don't really know what it means for the future, but I do know that Colombia just elected Gustavo Petro, who is a former Maoist guerrilla, which is, in a sense, perhaps not good. But the other thing is that, like, the other guy was also pretty bad. And Lula, who was a former president, is poised to defeat Jair Bolsonaro. So two other major economies, two other major nations in Latin America are moving towards the left. Now, that is the future, but who knows what this means for us? And that's what we're going to talk about in the next segment. Okay, so now it's time for a discussion of America's role. I think I can put this here. No, I can't. Put this here. There we go. Yes, I can. Okay, so America's role is to be determined, let's say. And it does depend on the president, right? There is this general myth that that Latin American policy is bipartisan and it's unified, but that's not really true. And then there's also this myth that the U.S. basically controls Latin American politics, which is not really true either, right? So let's first take, actually, let's go right to left. I speak Arabic, so let's do that. I don't, by the way, I don't speak Arabic. But it's a joke, right? Some people say I speak Hebrew. Now, there is no bipartisan There is no bipartisan unified Latin America policy. The truth is that the GOP tends to be more active in Latin America in terms of being against a lot of these socialist regimes. I mean, the GOP has been very strong against Venezuela, which the Democrats have also been have kind of like continued the Venezuela policy, which may or may not be a good thing. And the GOP has been very hard on Cuba, which the Democrats are not. Although that also is probably not good for the Floridian constituency of Cubans. So that is yet to be seen about what the political impact of that is. But yes, regarding Cuba, regarding Venezuela, the GOP is very, very hard on those regions. The Democrats tend to be more focused on human rights, which means that they don't just oppose Cuba and Venezuela, but they also oppose like the Bolsonaro government in Brazil and a few of these other governments. And they're also not particularly hard on Bolivia, where the GOP, pushed Janine Áñez during the Bolivia coup. The GOP, the Democrats did not, or the Democrats at least are fine with Evo Morales. At least his successor, Luis Arce. So, or Lucho, as some say. So, yes, the Democrats are more focused on human rights. And the Democrats tend to be more friendly with left-wing regimes in Latin America, although I don't think that's particularly ideological. Finally, the U.S. tends to be seen as a boogeyman in Latin America, which, is a bit questionable, right? Like, there's this general meme that the United States is this massive, this like ghost going around cooing countries in Latin America, which is not really true, right? The United States generally knows about the coups, but rarely actually plays a direct role in fomenting them, or at least in carrying them out. The U.S. does foment coups in other countries, obviously. I think the biggest example of that would be Chile, but at least the biggest, most well-known example would be Chile. But but the United States being a more active role, probably more like Guatemala or something like that. The U.S. did have a role in South America, but it was not as clear as some would like it to be. Anyway, that's really Cold War politics. The U.S. hasn't really done coups in Latin America in a while. The U.S. is not ideologically opposed to socialism anymore. That's not like the important thing for them. It's much more important whether they're pro-U.S. or anti-U.S., which it is true that socialist governments tend to be anti-US because socialist governments tend to get aid from the Soviet Union, which became Russia, and now Russia is still friends with a lot of these countries, like Venezuela, like Bolivia, etc. So, that's the primary reason for that. Like Russia and Cuba, Russia and Nicaragua, and China and Bolivia, those countries being together kind of makes it so that the U.S. Doesn't really want to be friends with them, and also it's like a circular, it's like a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? A circular feedback loop is what I'm thinking of. Anyway, the U.S. is not too ideologically opposed to socialism anymore, and I could point to a few things, right? Like Honduras, the U.S. is still kind of friends with Honduras now. Although Nicaragua, there are still some major issues there. And the U.S. is still friends with Peru and Chile, right? Even though they have socialist governments. So the U.S., I guess, is anti-authoritarian left, but not necessarily anti-left, generally. Okay. So Biden's Latin America policy, oh my God, has generally been supporting democracies and opposing authoritarians. True, right? Biden has opposed Bolsonaro more than he's opposed, like, Castillo, so that could be a definite truth there. But Biden still opposes integrating the first pink tide, Cuba, Nicaragua, Venezuela. Well, not Cuba, right? Cuba's not part of the first pink tide, unless the first pink tide began in 1959. Anyway, he still opposes integrating them into broader Latin American policy. So Cuba, Nicaragua, and Venezuela are still, out of the club, let's say. Peru and Chile, which are the two countries we've discussed, are still quite supportive of the U.S. And the same thing can be said for Mexico and Argentina, except they've also tried to increase ties to China. At least, well, not Mexico, but Argentina definitely has. Peru, Castillo's first international trips were to Mexico and the U.S., so that kind of shows like where their priorities lie. Chinese mining companies still have a huge stake in Peru, so there's a reason for Castillo to kind of be a bit questionable on his China policy because they still have a major role in Peru. But the other truth is that like Castillo's primary goal was nationalizing a lot of these mining companies. So like, that would also be bad for China at least. And then Boric in Chile openly criticizes China. And not only that, he openly criticizes the pro-China left, right? Like he says that just because you don't like the US does not mean you have to like China, and vice versa. So that's pretty interesting actually that that's happening right now. My take on this subject, and I have to move my camera again, is that Biden should continue on this path. Latin America is strategically important, although not as much as Southeast Asia or Eastern Europe. So what I mean by that, though, is that I do think that Biden centering Latin America is a good thing, primarily because of the historical ties and the fact that America's credence really relies on the fact that we can keep our own backyard not hating us, like Russia's backyard, Ukraine, not Belarus, but like the three Baltics and Finland definitely hate Russia, and even in like some of the Central Asian states, they're not huge fans of the Russians. Mongolia, for instance, as well. But we generally have support from our backyard, that being Mexico, Guatemala, and some of the Caribbean. So, that's true. But the other truth is that, like, that's beginning to change in certain regions, right? So, like, for instance, the Caribbean actually is now moving against the U.S., which I didn't really realize until recently, until going to the Caribbean and talking to the Prime Minister of St. Lucia and a few other things. So, yeah, that, as well as the isolation of Venezuela, I think that that's broadly fine. A lot of people on the left think that we should reproach Venezuela, and actually, the Biden administration, they are reproaching Venezuela. Reproach, by the way, is not R-E-P-R-O-A-C-H, it's R-A-P-P-R-O-C-H-E, which are two different words that mean two different things, literally antonyms. So I'm using reproach as in approach in a good way. Anyway, I think generally our Cuba policy has failed, but I wouldn't say our Venezuela policy has. Actually, something else to note very quickly is that a lot of these leaders still recognize Guaido as the leader of Venezuela. So that's quite interesting to keep in mind when we're talking about the ideological reasons for opposing American interventionism. Okay, and then finally, I think that the economic crisis in Latin America is definitely bad, but it's been going on since before COVID, and it can be used to continue green development in the region, which is important for Boric in Chile, Petro in Colombia, and Lula in Brazil. Hopefully, AMLO and Castillo come around to it, but I think that's primarily unlikely. So that is my discussion of the Latin American left. This could have been an hour. I don't know because I'm recording it in separate takes. But yeah, and sadly you're watching the best takes. Okay, you're watching the best takes of all of these. Although actually I did have one like straight through take that was the best ever, but I wasn't recording. Anyway, thank you for watching this explainer on the Latin American New Left. Hopefully you learned something. I definitely learned things researching this. And yeah, I mean, remember the change we need to see is always in progress. Thank you for watching.